Hello from overseas. I'm pleased to be able to speak to you. I will be speaking to you. The title of my talk is Overpowered, and the emphasis is on what science tells us about the need to minimize EMF radiation risk. The next slide starts off in a light mode with a cartoon, living with technological change. It's a family scene. The grandmother sitting reading the newspaper, her son sitting on his laptop, and sitting with his laptop, and standing there in the side is the next generation, the grandson, with his audio, with his new cell phone device. These are new technological changes that have come in, and we're living in an era where there's change occurring very, very rapidly. We are in I don't know, it's a new age, and we have to accommodate to these various changes. These new devices that are there, the laptop and the cell phone, are part of the developments that have occurred ever since Edison introduced the light bulb. The introduction of power has enabled the development of all these electronic instruments, and they utilize the electromagnetic spectrum, which is the next slide. It's a rather wordy kind of slide. In effect, it shows you the spectrum on the right-hand side with a huge range of frequencies of electric and magnetic fields being simultaneously transmitted, and one uses them. At the very bottom, you'll see power, electric power, which we are used to ever since they put up these power lines and the electric bulb and all these various other things. But as you see, as we go up the scale, there have been more and more things introduced, like radio and TV. And now we have the next line, the cell phone and Wi-Fi and smart meters. We've been basically inundated with all these different devices, including the microwave. Now, if you go further up, the very top, almost at the very top, you'll see this dashed line across the spectrum, and you see a divide between non-ionizing radiation and ionizing radiation. The difference is that the non-ionizing, does not have enough strength to pull electrons from atoms, but the ionizing one does, and that is very dangerous, and we know that ionizing radiation can cause harm, and we've been accustomed to that and prepared for that. We protect ourselves from X-rays. That's one of the things that everybody knows. And we also know that ultraviolet light is something that can damage us, and we know that it can damage the skin. Now, that is what we've been living with for a while, but the non-ionizing radiation has been around also a long time. That is at the sunlight part. And we've lived with that, except we know that at some point we can get a burn that is quite severe, and it does harm to the skin. But we haven't realized that we can get damage pretty much across the range. And that's one of the things I'm going to try and impress upon you, that these electromagnetic waves, rays, or energy, or whatever you want to refer to it, that is present, has the ability to interact with living material and to cause damage. And as a result, we must protect ourselves. But we don't know quite how things are happening. Therefore, there is a need to explore this area, and we have been doing that. The problem is that there's a controversy, and we will explore that one as well. The next slide is on finding the answers. In other words, how do we go about finding out if there's any danger associated with this radiation that we're now living with? The main approach has been epidemiology. In other words, we study populations that correlate with the disease and with exposure that correlate the two, and therefore we can find out if there is a relationship between the exposure and the disease that occurs. Now, as you can tell, the focus is on the outcome. If you get the disease, then you know it's been bad. But if you don't get it, then, well, then it's not going to cause harm. And that has been the basic approach. It's kind of interesting that the approach started basically in the UK, in England. Dr. John Snow, who was a doctor working in Soho, was there at the time when there was a cholera epidemic. And this was back in the mid-1800s. And when the cholera was in full force and causing many to be stricken with this disease and dying, by the way. It was not a trivial kind of disease. The thing is that he started to make a map, and his map is the one that led him to what was going on. He put a dot on the various houses in the map that were in Soho, and he found that there was a distribution of these dots around the source of the water for the population. It was the pump on Broad Street that was the center of that distribution of dots, and he then took the bull by the horns and broke the pump and shut it off so nobody could use it. And believe it or not, the epidemic abated. Now, that was the first real attempt to apply epidemiological thinking, and it was quite successful. And people have been doing that ever since in far more sophisticated ways, as we will see. Now, let us now go and see what we're dealing with in terms of these different fields. If we start with the power frequency or very low, extremely low frequency fields, ELF fields, the next slide shows you power lines that are used to transmit the power to the population, and a suspended fluorescent bulb. That bulb is suspended, held up by a clamp, but not connected electrically to anything. But it's getting the electromagnetic energy from the power lines themselves. So this energy is transmitted without any visible means of support. And the thing is that it is just as effective because you see the bulb is burning brightly in this field. Now, people have been studying the effects of these ELF fields, and the next slide shows that ELF has been found to increase the risk of diseases. Now, I'll give you a list of some of these in there. You see that leukemia has been found to double at 3 to 4 milligauss. Alzheimer's and neurological diseases have been shown to increase with 5 to 8 milligauss. And breast cancer has also been linked in a range that isn't quite clear, but between 2 and 12 milligauss. These are very, very low levels of fields. And milligauss is, barely, well, it's as low as you can go in trying to characterize the energy associated with it. But if you look at the bottom line, the safety limit that has been set and is generally accepted is 1,000 milligauss, far larger than the levels at which these diseases occur. The next slide shows that these diseases are even present in fetal exposure. In other words, when one studies the incidence of disease, this is a case of Dr. Lee in California, who found that you can get, you can cause miscarriage in the first trimester if you reach 16 milligauss. That's relatively high, but if when the child was born, Dr. Lee followed them up, and at the age of about early teenage, he found that the population of those whose mothers were exposed got asthma and were obese at double the rate of the general population, which suggests very clearly that these people were affected in utero, and that the result was two of the very big problems that we're now confronting with young children. I mean, obesity has been in epidemic range, and the same thing with asthma in young children. So this is a kind of a quick summary of what we know about ELF, power frequency, but there's also an awful lot that we know about the radio frequency. The next slide shows you a picture of the Sucro Tower in California, which is the source of a lot of different radiation. You see them listed on the left-hand side of the slide, and the tower is very tall. And you can look at the scale and get an idea of the scale from the houses that are there on the lower part of the slide. This radiation has resulted in a large number of cancers in children, or children defined through teenagers. The next slide shows you the relationship between the incidence of cancer and the distance from this tower. And this is about 50 years of data that have been accumulated. They were correlated by Dr. Neil Cherry, who then did a big report and drew this graph, which is on the slide. And you see that there's a distribution of the problems associated with it. The childhood cancers, the risk is plotted versus the distance from the tower. And as you'd expect, those closest at a higher risk, and as you go further away, the risk is diminished. But if you go at a distance of 3 kilometers, which is approximately 2 miles, you see that the risk is still a level of 6. Now, he also measured the energy in the different ranges and found that the energy at this 2-mile range was still 1,000 times lower than the safety standard. Obviously, the safety standard is not relevant at all to when you're dealing with human exposure. Now, the next slide is another approach that's been used on trying to find the answers. It is the more scientific one that we're accustomed to, that is the classic sciences, studying biochemistry and physiology with the aim of determining the mechanism. And this has been a rather fruitful way of finding out. The next slide is labeled "Cells react to EMF as harmful." Now, there are mechanisms inside the body which are used to protect the body, and one is called the cellular stress response. It means that the cells start to respond by starting to make proteins that help to protect the body. They repair the damage, and they also will prevent further damage in the various mechanisms. Now, when the body reacts this way, it is basically telling you that the EMF is harmful. It does so with all kinds of other things, such as pH changes, introduction of alcohol, and so on. Now, the interesting thing about the stress proteins is they come about because the DNA starts to make them. Proteins are not just come out of thin air. The DNA, which carries our code inside each cell, it comes apart and it starts to manufacture these particular proteins. Now, if you get too strong a signal, the EMF can actually damage the DNA. That's the next slide. You see pictures that were published by Lay and Singh, which found that the greater the intensity of the extremely low frequency, power frequency, or the longer the exposure, you get more and more fragments breaking off from the DNA. So it is quite clear that the exposure to DNA causes this kind of damage, and it is therefore quite harmful to be exposed to this relatively high level of EMF. I should point out that this is a higher intensity than the level of the previous slide, which showed the stress response. So that the message is that if you get a slight level, and we'll talk about the point at which these changes occur is very low for the stress response. But if you get too strong, you actually break up the DNA. And both of these effects have been shown pretty much across the spectrum, as the next slide shows. We have these X marks that show across the spectrum, and you see that both of these effects have been noted in different areas of the spectrum. And we've known about the gamma rays and the X-rays for quite a while, but you see it extends all the way down to the power frequency, ELF range. Now, how does this thing work in terms of generating the stress of proteins? The next slide shows you a picture of the DNA. And this is a chromosome that is actually being unraveled before us so that we can see what the components are. And we recognize the double helix at the bottom center, which is we're quite familiar with. These are the 2 strands of DNA that are held together by these thin lines, which are bases. These are chemicals that actually contain the code that is used to generate the proteins. Now, the DNA is 6 feet long in each cell, and it gets packed into a small nucleus, which is the order of microns. Can you imagine how you can get all of that into such a small volume? And the way the body does it is that it's really coiled and recoiled and supercoiled and all these things. And you see that you've got a whole different level of coils that are present in the system. The interesting thing about this is that if you go back to the structure, the double helix with the bases holding the double helix together, the bases are chemicals that have electrons lined on both bases. So you've got really a ribbon going through the nucleus that has electrons on both sides of the ribbon, and they're coiled in different ways. Now, the thing about the ribbon with electrons on it is that they bear a very strong resemblance to what we call antennas. In other words, antennas with metals that have electrons in them can be used to react to these different electromagnetic waves, and they can react depending on the length of the antenna. Some of you may remember the old antennas that were used when TV was introduced. They had different sizes. Well, the different sizes were used to tune to the different ranges of electromagnetic waves that were sent out. And basically, we've got the same arrangement in the DNA. The next slide gives you an indication of the different sizes of coiled structures that are present in the nuclear DNA. And you see that you get very small helices going up to very large ones. And basically, this means that your DNA can react with a variety of different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation and optimize for each particular frequency by choosing the different, not choosing, but having the different size cells, different size coils react with the radiation that is hitting them. Now, the next slide calls this the afractal antenna. This is a term that's been introduced. The next slide, you should show the next slide, is the term fractal antenna. And it's that the electrons in the different coil sizes react to different frequencies. And as a result, the DNA can interact with a very wide range of frequencies. And the next slide points out that this reaction can cause damage and it can cause disease. And the result is that exposure stimulates the breaks and it stimulates the biosynthesis, the repair in the DNA. And normally what happens is that these cells the DNA will normally make proteins, and usually they're okay, but every once in a while, 1 per billion molecules synthesized will get some damage, and usually the damage is removed. There are different kinds of breaks can occur. They can occur in a single strand or in both strands, which is really a pretty big problem because you have nothing to hold the thing together while you're doing the repair. And the damage accumulates, and people have seen that if you have identical twins who are born with the same DNA all the time, very shortly their DNAs show differences, and that these differences will depend on if they have problems with their repair mechanisms. And this is the last study that's listed there, which found that children who have problems that don't have their repair genes problem, in fact, will show a greater risk of diseases like leukemia. The next slide basically summarizes that the safety standards are not working because they're not set by at the right levels. They have not taken these various effects into account. They're generally set by physicists and engineers who historically were the ones who got into the EMF business because they could deal with the nuts and bolts of putting together these devices and repairing them. But it failed to take into account that that these reactions are occurring at a biological level and that these reactions are quite harmful. Now, the next slide gives you a summary and gives you 3 examples of cell reactions that are that we know of that occur at relatively low levels that are pretty basic. Next slide. It shows the sodium-potassium ATPase has been shown to have a very, very low threshold. This is the enzyme that works in the cell to establish the ion gradients, the concentrations of potassium higher in the cell than outside, and the reason, and that is the basis for the excitation. The nerves could not work if the sodium-potassium ATPase didn't work. The cytochrome oxidase is the enzyme that is primarily responsible for generating the ATP that drives our cells. So you see that these are reactions that are very fundamental and that they're affected at very low levels in comparison to the standard, which is set at 1,000 milligauss. Now the next slide shows that there are additional problems with the standards, not only that they're way out of line in terms of the level that they're at, but each level of the spectrum is considered pretty much by itself, and the effect of the DNA are additive. If you get damage to DNA in one range, it doesn't matter what's happening in the other range. The other range can also get damaged, and they add up. Now, the people who studied the safety or who set the standard believe that you have to pass a certain energy threshold to get to see a problem, but in effect, that's not true. We have that there is no high energy threshold. There is a threshold for energy for damage, and that occurs when the reaction is when the reaction occurs that affects the electron. Now, there are key issues health-wise that we can see from a physical point of view in analysis. You see that the EMF will react with all charges and quite easily with electrons that are very highly charged in comparison to the mass that they have. They're very light and they have the charge, and therefore DNA is particularly vulnerable. The thresholds are very low, as we've seen, and although we don't know the threshold for pathological changes, they are bound to be not very far from the reaction threshold. Now, our problem is that our problem as humans, we do not detect the EMF, and therefore we need some devices, meters, to tell us that when they are there. Now, the next slide points out another problem, and that is that industry has felt threatened by this information, and as a result, they have reacted in a way to basically not sabotage, but to slow down the rate at which research is done. This is a book by David Michaels, really talking about the issue and referring to the cigarette problem, which we had, and we have in a minor way now in comparison. But he talks about the fact that doubt has been the product that has been introduced by people in industry to try and introduce a controversy and kind of slow things down. They've done that quite successfully in some ways. If you look at the next slide, we've seen that even in affecting the research, they have set up, the next slide, please, that one of the studies that was done was set up in such a way that they ended up with eliminating the subscribers, eliminating the most frequently used people who use cell phones by saying that they want to make sure that everyone was an individual user, and so they eliminated the most frequent users, like corporate people. And the other thing is they made the assumption that cordless phones were not cell phones. It's just true, they're not cell phones, but they use the same technology and you get the same problems. Now, the next slide shows you the key issues that we're dealing with in the human population. And that is that we love these devices. They are fantastic. and you can tell that they're addictive too, which is another problem. That we love them, and they're very useful for personal and business uses. And of course, the industry has a huge stake in them, and the Defense Department, which is no small component of this problem, has a very great interest in the development of devices based on this technology. Now, the next slide is how do we deal with the next slide, please. The next slide is how we deal with these problems in general, that we try and introduce standards that are based on the biology, which is something that hasn't been done. That is, it's not heating up the cell, it's the reactions that are started in the cells that are critical, and that we must test devices before they're used. But in any case, we must develop EMF-free areas. And this is particularly important in schools, where children sit there 5-6 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they're constantly in this field, in these different fields. And this can be done by cables rather than introduction of Wi-Fi systems. One does not need to have it bathing the whole environment. It can be done when just in the devices that need to be used. Now, we can also redesign buildings so that we minimize the energy that is electromagnetic energy that's used for heating and lighting. And the best kind of device, the best tactic is that we must have an informed public and mobilize their efforts for safer devices. The particular one that we find now people are becoming conscious of is the use of cell phones in cars. That is not only an electromagnetic problem, it's a problem of diverting attention from people so that they lose sight, lose control of their cars. Now, the next slide is various, no, go back one slide, please. That we must increase, we can do things by ourselves. It does not depend on the laws that are passed. We should increase the distance between the EMF sources. We not place a laptop on laps, for example. There are companies that sell various protections for under laptops. A company called Shield Your Body, which uses protective devices that they even have for lining babies' cribs, or cots, I guess it's called in England. And this can be a very easy way to make sure that you're not getting that kind of exposure in children that are confined to these small cots that they spend pretty much their lifetimes in. We should also switch off the power from various devices and when they're not in use. And if you're in doubt, you can use a meter to measure the exposure. And in any case, we can lessen the use consciously. And I believe that these are important measures that we can do by ourselves, although it's much more effective if we can get the government or some agencies to control the release. Now, I'd like to end with an appeal that has been made to the UN and the WHO by over 200 scientists who have published studies on this to try and influence what's going on publicly so that we have greater control over our environment and we minimize the exposure that people are being subjected to. Thank you.